Hello, this is Gonzalo Lira speaking to you live, and welcome to the Roundtable number 17. I can't believe I'm in the double digits and nearly at 20. This is very exciting for me, because there isn't a hell of a lot to do here in Kharkov, Ukraine. I want to welcome you all in the chat. Thank you very much for showing up, and I hope you enjoy the show that we're going to have. We're going to be discussing the philosophy of Alexander Dugin, the Russian philosopher who's been in the news for rather tragic circumstances. And I'm here joined by two wonderful guests who know his work intimately, as they have both translated parts of his work into English. First of all, I want to welcome Michael Millerman. Michael, how's it going?
It's going well. Good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, it's my pleasure, really. I follow you on Twitter. And by the way, the link to both Michael and Mark's Twitter is in the description down below. I hope that you'll follow them both. And yeah, I follow you, Michael, because your Twitter feed is just fantastic, and I had no idea that you were a Dugin scholar, and so I happen to know Mark Sleboda. Mark, how's it going? Good to see you, my friend.
I'm alive. How are you, Gonzalo?
You keep saying that. There's more. Be happy, joyous about life. Anyway,
no,
it's.
I'm a fatalist and a cynic. Let's go.
Yeah, well, I'm a cheerful fatalist and a cheerful cynic. I figure, the whole shit show is going to go up in flames, but might as well have a laugh while we're at it. Mark, it's so good to have you on. And before we get started, I just want to mention to people something that's been on the news. Of course, the war in Ukraine here is continuing on as usual. And, there's been this famous Kherson offensive. And as a part of this Kherson offensive, apparently, I don't know if you guys have been following it, Michael and Mark, but there's been this attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power station, which has been shelled consistently by Ukraine, by the Zelensky regime forces. And they tried to take it today, just as the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors were arriving at the power plant. What do either one of you think of it? What do you guys say to that? What do you think of that whole situation?
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely crazy. I mean, this is like something that was scripted in Hollywood, or more likely MI6, according to everything that I've been hearing.
Yeah.
All of the participants, and there were at least several hundred from the Kiev regime forces, I don't know about all of them, but evidently a large percentage of them just finished training. Their 3 weeks wonderful military training, as if 3 weeks can train you for anything military wise, not even for basic infantry. But they came right from that into this. And, as so much of things, the Kiev regime is riddled with thousands of people who, don't support it. They haven't supported it from 2014. A lot of people have just been getting by. And I mean, the Western media has long admitted that, they're just riddled with moles for Russia. Just a few weeks ago, he fired his head of the Zelensky, the head of the regime, fired his head of the SBU, a lifelong friend, actually. And a guy who had run his entertainment, his comedy troupe, Kvartal 95, and had ran his political party that he created, right in line with his TV show, where he accidentally became the president. He is the ultimate virtual leader. The servant of the People Party. So, I mean, he fired him and his head of the federal prosecutor's office because evidently some 600 traitors or collaborators were found just in the ranks of the intelligence services and the federal prosecutor's office, to say nothing of the Western media even reports of hundreds of people arrested in every major city in Ukraine as collaborators, right? And this is ongoing, right? This is just what they got for that moment. So obviously, despite the way this is all presented in the Western media, there are a whole lot of Ukrainians who are working inside to topple this regime, just as there are tens of thousands of Ukrainians fighting alongside Russian forces, particularly from the east of the country, to get rid of this regime. So,
but wait, hang on a second. I just want to backtrack a little bit because I got to fill in the audience as to what has happened. Okay, this is what happened. The nuclear power station at Zaporozhye is on the river Dnieper, and it's actually on like a small little point
on the south side.
On the south side, which is currently controlled by Russian forces. They actually captured the nuclear power station very early on in the conflict, as I understand it. And as I understand, the nuclear power station provides 20% of Ukraine's pre-February 24th Ukraine's energy needs. And it has continued to supply the energy needs of the North Shore and to the north of Ukraine. The Russians have not interrupted that electrical service.
Until last week.
Until last week, yeah.
When they blew up the electric lines themselves, preventing Russia from powering.
Because this is the key issue, that this nuclear power station, which I do believe is the largest in Europe, as a matter of fact, has been under consistent shelling by the Ukraine forces, and the Ukraine forces are blaming Russia. And of course, it doesn't make any sense, because if Russia is holding the nuclear power station, why would they shell themselves? It doesn't make any sense, of course. And when you talk to Western authorities, they very, very carefully sidestep the issue of who is actually the one shelling the nuclear power station. It's like it's being shelled by, I don't know. We don't know. How can we know? The fog of war, crap like that. Okay. So anyway, the issue that happened last night or the night before and yesterday was that the Zelensky regime forces, they brought in some commandos, some Ukraine commandos who had been trained at least for 3 weeks in the UK. They brought them straight from the UK, crossed the Polish border, brought them down to Zaporozhye, and they tried to take the nuclear power station at the time that the inspectors from the Atomic Energy Agency were going to inspect it to determine where the shelling was coming from. And in this process, they used some boats and approximately 60 of these commandos in this mission. And apparently, from what you were saying, the Russians knew exactly where they were from the moment they crossed the border from Poland into Ukraine. They knew second to second, and they knew the plan. And of course, if you have a plan and your opponent knows your plan, you have no plan at all. And so what happened was that the Russians killed at least 47 of these individuals. They have captured 2 of them, actually 4 of them. 2 of them are alive and well. 2 more are in critical condition and being treated by medical personnel. And an additional 7, I believe, are basically, I don't quite understand the circumstances, but they seem to be trapped and unable to get out. That's a little inconclusive at this time. That's not very important. But what is important is that it seems to have been a project masterminded by, if you want to call it that, by the British MI6, which is British intelligence, and at the instigation of Boris Johnson, apparently. Boris Johnson seems to have been the big cheerleader of this foolish, reckless operation. And here we have this crisis going on. So sorry, I just needed to give a little background before we get into it. But so I rudely interrupted you, Mark. Please continue.
No, you got to the point I was trying to get to, that Russia knew about it. I was in a ridiculously circular segue. So they came in 2 waves. The first one was with speedboats, and then a second one was to come later, more troops in barges. This was timed to coincide with the arrival of the inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Association, the IAEA. We know now from what Russia has put out, it wasn't clear before, that the team is composed from a variety of countries, so that it's not all institutionally captured by Western members. And at Russia's insistence, it does include some ballistics experts, which I had not been aware of up until today. So they will be able to make some type of assessment confirming. I mean, we already know this because at the very start of this, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense cheerfully posted on their official Telegram channel that they had begun attacks on the nuclear power plant with suicide drones and had hit Russian forces there. And then 2 days later, it's suddenly, oh, it's the Russians shelling themselves, right? They're firing at us out from the plant and firing at themselves into the plant to create a nuclear catastrophe to blow themselves up in order to blame us. I mean, that's the ridiculous narrative. No one believes that, right? Yeah. I mean, even their own supporters don't believe this.
Actually, some of their supporters are denying that this even happened.
Yeah.
It's all a Russian, invention.
No offense, but Sergei Shoigu couldn't dream up something this crazy in his dreams.
It's foolish.
I mean, they have no air support for this, right?
Yeah.
They have limited long-range artillery support from the other side of the Dnieper Reservoir that they launched it from. And, Russian attack helicopters just mowed them down. The barges never even got to shore. So I presume that the death count is going to end up being much higher. At the end
Mark,
of this,
I'll ask you this, that you have better information than I do at this time. Now, the word is that I had heard, and you confirm or deny it, that MI6 was the brains behind this stupid operation, and that it was fomented by Boris Johnson, if not originally brainstormed by him. Is this an accurate assessment, or is there anything in there that's not correct?
The what I have heard, and it is reports, right? It is not confirmed, that MI6 was indeed behind it. And it's not so surprising. I mean, just the Washington Post this morning also admitted that the entire Ukraine also suicidal counteroffensive from Kryvyi Rog down to Kherson was planned by the West and war gamed by the United States, right? I mean, so at this point, they admitted that openly. I mean, that in the Washington Post. I mean, so it's not like let's not pretend that the regime in Kiev actually has any agency at this point, at least when push comes to shove. So, I mean, the West is running this. It is a proxy war to the most extreme degree of the definition of the word.
Now, the part of that I didn't know was that they had war gamed this in Washington.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, they openly admitted that.
No, but the thing is, see, apart from admitting it, they should have realized that they would get annihilated.
Yeah, I've been part of plenty of U.S. military war games as I served in the military, and they're not all. U.S. war gaming is another virtual reality. Let's just put it that way. It has very little relation to any realistic circumstances.
Yeah, no, I find this absurd, and the thing that troubles me deeply about this situation is that you're seeing the number of casualties that the Russian Ministry of Defense is reporting. Now, to those of you who are skeptical, the Russian Ministry of Defense, whenever they release information, they have it cold. They never say something that turns out to later be untrue.
They sometimes will omit things.
Yes.
Yes.
They lie by omission.
By omission, yes.
And I don't know if that's actually a lie if you just don't mention something. It depends.
Aside of having Russia having complete air superiority and having a 15-to-1 at least artillery advantage, and that's according to the Kiev regime. Yeah, right. They have all of their best troops at this point have been attrition down to nothing. So everything is territorial defense and new conscripts, and they are able to assemble mass human waves that way. Yes, but they don't have heavy gear. The best things they have is handfuls of old Polish T-72s. Tanks that they've been handed off, and they're expected to rush across open, flat steppe. I don't know if you can find plenty of these videos online, at least on the Russian Telegram channels, of these poor SOBs, for the Kiev regime, a lot of them conscripts. I feel nothing but pity for them. Yeah. Being forced to cross the steppe under just constant, heavy, I mean, and they're even using the Tols 1A, this thermobaric flamethrower on them, and that is just a brutal, horrendous weapon. Because you don't have to worry about any civilian casualties, right? I mean, it's open steppe. Yeah. So it's brutal. The casualties are awful.
to the American audience who might not know, these steppes are basically the equivalent of the Great Plains in the United States. It's Iowa cow country. It's just flat as a pancake.
It's awful for the offense. Now, this is completely different from the terrain in East Ukraine, which is heavy urban agglomeration, very with factories, every couple of miles. And the Soviet Union built their factories like fortresses, right? Yeah. With bunkers, Cold War era bunkers and everything beneath them. And that whole area has been built up in multiple layered lines of defense with concrete and steel fortifications for 8 years, right? And it just all flows together there. That's why Russia has to go, the Russian and Donbass forces there have to do this slow, methodical grinding, this shaping the battlefield with heavy artillery for weeks ahead of time to destroy the fortifications and so forth. They're on their own timetable. They don't care about the Western mainstream media cycle. They're doing it with a very limited force, much smaller than the Ukrainian military that they're attacking with, and they're succeeding. But it is presented as stalling or exhausted, or they're out of this and they're out of this the next week. It's all nonsense. It's just the type of war that they're waging that they can wage indefinitely. They are slowly, incrementally succeeding at this. But this is completely different over here in the south in Kherson. It's open steppe. It's this is what, once these last two defensive lines in the Donbass are cleared, that's what the rest of Ukraine will be like, because there's no such urban agglomerated with fortifications in the rest of the country. So that's
and it looks like the Russians are preparing exactly for that, because they are amassing a force that's estimated between 45,000 and 60,000 troops. With their T-90 tanks, which they have not deployed in this war. The T-90 tanks are apparently their most sophisticated, and they're amassing them. And so clearly they're getting ready for a big sweep. And they'll be able to, because like you said, it's just flat.
There will be a huge counteroffensive back. And when all these forces are exhausted and they've emptied out the garrisons of Odessa and everywhere else, and then it will just be going to town in the south. But you can maybe attest, maybe you can, I don't know, but there's lots of chatter. I mean, it's more than chatter at this point, that Kiev has also assembled a very large strike force in Kharkov. And they've actually moved them in the gear, what tanks and artillery that they can, into the metro system. That's
the word I'm hearing, but I'm hearing it from Telegram
to protect them
online.
From,
I don't know on the ground.
Anyway, so there's a big chance. Everything points towards a second Kiev offensive, not pre-announced, towards Izium, south of Kharkov, to try to cut Russian supply lines there, coming down from Belarus in the north. Russia and Belarus.
What's deeply troubling about the Kherson offensive, of course, is that the Ukrainian armed forces, the Zelensky regime forces, they are using their best troops and all they've got. They've actually pulled troops out of Odessa that were defending Odessa to reinforce this offensive, and they're losing those troops.
This is excellent for the Russian military, because these troops would be much more effective hiding in what fortifications they have, right? Again, they're conscripts for the most part with very light weaponry. They would be much better defending. Here, they're being lined up on the flat steppe to be annihilated by artillery. Russia doesn't have to worry about civilian casualties here. It doesn't have to worry about fortifications. It's like a game of Space Invaders, and it's awful. It's awful. No, it's awful to say that, right?
I mean, we're not being jocular or not trying to get a laugh out of it. It's
what we're hearing from the Russians. They're like, guys, please stop. We are getting sick of killing you. Because again, you don't have to believe the Russian sources, because the Ukrainian sources are talking about the huge queues at the blood banks in Odessa and Nikolaev because of the hundreds and hundreds of wounded that are being brought in just awful condition. And it's a sin. It's a sin. And this was ordered by Zelensky over the heads of his generals for political reasons, because there's a donors conference by the West coming up again on the 8th, and they need to secure some type of success, you know, to go into that, to present the idea that they're worth the image. It was the same thing with this attack on the nuclear power plant. Evidently, they intended to essentially effectively use the IAEA team there as de facto human shields or hostages, assuming that Russia wouldn't just storm to take the plant back because of the presence of those inspectors. And that was all done, again, to grab international headlines, to show some type of... It's creative, but it's entirely fictional and was cooked up of someone with no knowledge of military realities whatsoever, which is to say MI6.
Yeah, and so look, that's the state of play in the war right now, and it's just heartbreaking, because all these young men are throwing their lives away or having their lives thrown away for them by just cavalier and despicable people who only care about headlines. But let's leave that aside for the moment, because what this conversation is really about, and poor Michael has been very patiently, you know, listening to us rant and just tear our hair out, or the few hairs we have remaining. That's why I grow my hair long, because I'm going bald. No, it's a tragedy. But let's focus on Alexander Dugin, because that's why I wanted to bring you both gentlemen here. And Michael, I want to turn to you a little bit, and I'd ask you, because here's the thing. Chat will agree with me that we all hear in the West about Alexander Dugin, that he's Putin's brain, and that he's the puppeteer of Putin. In fact, you know, the Rasputin-like figure, even though, as I understand it, they've never actually met, and there's certainly no picture of them together. And so I wanted to ask you, who is Dugin? Where did he come from? How did he get the prominence that he currently has? And is he a great Russian thinker, or is he just another very distinguished scholar, but there are others like him, but for some reason the West picked him up? I mean, give us a little background, if you will, about Alexander Dugin.
Yeah, so I have my own perspective on some of this, which may differ from what some of Dugin's opponents in the West might think, and it may differ even from what Mark has to say. I'd be curious to know, because as I understand, the two of them worked together. But let's start with the question, is Dugin a great Russian thinker? In my view, the answer is yes, he is a great Russian thinker. So first, we need to be able to understand what a great thinker is. And a great thinker is somebody who has a comprehensive attempt to grasp the nature of human life, political life, history, metaphysics, ontology, those kinds of things. So in other words, a great thinker at least should be a philosopher, and at most should be a political philosopher whose expansiveness includes all the other disciplines. In my view, that's exactly accurate about Dugin. He's a multidisciplinary thinker who puts philosophy above all, and who sees himself as a Russian philosopher trying to give a fair account of the other civilizations and the other possible ways of knowing and being in the world. So in my view, that's a closed question in a sense. He's a great thinker. The reason why a lot of people don't necessarily see that is because Dugin combines in himself, in my view, various functions that usually are spread out across more than one person. So he's a philosopher, he's an ideologue, he's an activist. He can be a very good and fiery rhetorician when he needs to be, and he can also be a very good pure expositor of pure philosophy, so to speak. So people, let's say, who start from the bottom up, I mean from the lowest, most vulgar version of what Dugin has contributed to the world, like let's say the most ideologically charged statements, or whatever they find when they read the worst news about him, they don't go farther. So they don't go, let's say they search him up, they Google Alexander Dugin, they say, oh, he's a Satanist, here's a picture of him standing next to David Duke, therefore we know everything we need to know about Dugin, we don't need to take any more steps. And that, of course, as always, absolves them of all of the responsibility of reading, learning, studying, thinking. You know, like, to understand a great thinker takes time and effort, and it also takes a certain kind of greatness, I think, in yourself. So if you have very mediocre people who don't want to invest the time or the effort, then they draw conclusions that don't fit the case, in my view. Okay, so on the other hand, though, people who start to poke around his works, or at least who listen to his interviews, and you don't have to speak Russian, although the more you can listen to him in Russian, I think the more you'll understand that he's a great thinker. So Mark and I have translated some of his books. He's done interviews in English. Other people have translated other books. So there's something to work with. But just as the two of you were saying that the Western press really has no interest in getting the facts about Ukraine right, for sure they have no interest in getting the facts about Dugin right. So there's always just the worst misrepresentations of his thought, up to really perverse and embarrassing claims. Like, for example, there were some Russian experts who recently claimed after the death of his daughter that he himself had organized her hit as part of a ritual esoteric sacrifice, that kind of thing. So these people are not only sick and twisted, they're also, in my view, malicious and low IQ, so to speak. So that's to set aside the question of whether he's a great thinker. Now the question, why is he best known among the other Russian thinkers? Because he's not the only one. Well, I think partly he fits a stereotype of what the Russian other might look like. So he doesn't look like the sort of, clean-shaven European liberal Russian other. He looks like the traditional bearded, mystical, religious, orthodox, imperialist Russian other. So that in itself lends him a certain mystique. You can find pictures of him when he was younger and he looked a little bit different, and it's hard to know whether he would have the same mystique if he had carried that look through. So that's part of it. Another part of it is that I think he has made more of an effort and been more successful than other Russian thinkers in conveying his thought to the West, in interacting with and engaging with Western intellectuals, Western figures, authors, traditions, movements, all of those kinds of things. He's done, just think about another comparable Russian intellectual who has similar greatness of thought, who has done as many Western podcast interviews and media interviews and publications as Dugin has. I don't think you're going to find many. There are Russian thinkers, in my view, by the way, if anybody's listening to this and speaks Russian and English and wants to translate, do it. Translate the Russian authors that you think are outstanding, other than Dugin. Start to bring them into the Western world, into English circulation. Very important that to translate someone, to study someone, to explain them, doesn't always mean to agree with them. There's Prakhanov, in my opinion, a person well worth listening to, learning from, reading, and there are many others, but they're not as widely available in English. They don't have necessarily the look, and they also didn't somehow capture the zeitgeist. That means both the Russian zeitgeist and the international zeitgeist. We're dealing with a situation where the West is going through its own kind of postmodern perversities. It's reached the end of history, doesn't know what to do with itself. And Dugin was able to crystallize in thoughtful analysis exactly what was going on in the West, exactly what's going on in Russia, and in a way that maps onto other places, so that he has readers in Iran and Brazil and Turkey and elsewhere, in China, people who are looking for a model to make sense of the world. So all of those things together, I think, help explain why he's been uniquely prominent among Russian thinkers. And then to the kind of final question of the ones that you asked me, which is his influence. There's no picture of him and there's no, recorded meetings, let's say. So what do we do with the question of influence? So here I have a couple of thoughts I want to share. The first one is that when we think about influence, it's not so straightforward when it comes to philosophy and power, the right way to think about influence. So for example, because we have no photograph of Dugin with Putin, therefore there's no influence of Dugin's thought on Putin's. That's the wrong way, in my view, of thinking about it. Because, for example, this is the same.
You read a book.
it's the same reductive logic as guilt by association, which is I have a picture of you with David Duke, I have a picture of you with Brzezinski, right? So it reduces all question of thinking and influence to like photographic evidence. So that I think is a mistake. I'll give you a quick example. So people watching this may or may not know, I assume that most of you have heard by now that Dugin's daughter was killed in an assassination, car bombing in Moscow. Russian television put out a kind of commemoration of her life recently on Channel 1. I don't think it's available in English, but you can watch it in Russian. And Dugin has some comments that he makes after the attack, okay? So like some of his most recent comments are in that video. Somebody asks him, about the question of his influence on Putin, and he gives an answer that, in my view, is much closer to the truth than the one about photographic evidence. He says that he is tapping into, in his thinking, he's tapping into the same thing that Putin is tapping into as the leader of the country. In other words, philosopher, the people in the sense of folk or narod, like people in the sense of peoples, the Russian people, the Russian philosopher, the Russian people in the Russian centers of power, to the extent that they act consistently with Russian identity, they're somehow tapping into the same well. And Dugin, as a philosopher, has tapped into that well quite deeply, and therefore can lay out the possible future road for the Russian soul, politically, ideologically, philosophically. So it's not, doesn't have to be a direct influence. That's first, you see what I mean? Like the philosopher thinks out the blueprint of the possible political actions. That is a subtle but crucial, in my viewpoint. I'll just say one more thing, okay? So that's like the mysterious philosophical influence of thought on power. There's this great quote, I won't quote it from memory, by John Maynard Keynes, where he says that, madmen in authority, when they are doing their, formulating their policies and they think that they're the source of their own formulation, they're distilling voices from the air of some academic scribbler from years gone by. So in other words, I think that when people in politics try to formulate a path forward, whether they know it or not, this is the indirect argument, they're drawing on the cloud of ideas that Dugin has been producing for 30 years. That's often missed, and understandably so, because you have to be attuned to the possibility of subtle influence in order even to be able to think that kind of thing through. That said, if you look at Dugin's biography from the 80s and 90s, and you see the parties that he influenced and the people that he influenced and who read his thought and who developed his ideas and parts of his worldview, parts of his conceptual apparatus were distributed so that there are people who could have gone into power or who could have been close to centers of power, who, whether they gave him credit for it or not, were drawing on the concepts he developed. So these are all the reasons why, in my view, the question of influence is usually badly posed. And I think in some sense, he's right. He said he and Vladimir Putin read the Russian destiny in the same golden letters in the sky. It's that kind of thing. And there are people, by the way, you could have pictures of Putin having met with 20 different people. There's no guarantee that they have, quote unquote, exerted influence on his thoughts. So that's my take. I don't know, maybe that gets something right and something wrong, but that's how I see it. A great thinker who's developed a comprehensive Russian teaching and in this way has seeded the conceptual landscape for whoever else tries to think.
Yeah, I mean, like it would seem to me it's basically, you have the zeitgeist, the thinking in the air. The fact that Dugin became prominent is because he was tapping into it, just as Putin is tapping into that same Russian zeitgeist. And so just because they're tapping into the same source, if you will, it doesn't mean that one is influencing the other necessarily, although certainly by Dugin distilling that in his writing, his writing would not be popular if it was not correctly distilling that zeitgeist. And so because of it, Putin would have been influenced by it because he's distilling that which Putin himself perceived. Is that more or less your argument?
Yeah, that's part of it. Also, look, if you're going to express a political project or program, if you're going to have a direction politically in the world, you need to have the language with which to express it. So Dugin, for 30 years, has been developing the vocabulary that allows any political actor who wants Russia to analyze, and all the more so to break from, Western liberal modernity. He's been developing a vocabulary, a well thought out one. He's not the only, obviously there are other, nationalists, imperialists, reactionaries, great statists, but he's somebody whose model has deliberately tried to produce the possibility of a full articulation from the point of view of several disciplines: political theory, philosophy, ethnosociology, a book I translated, geopolitics, psychology, all of these, in order to get a genuine alternative to Western liberal political modernity. In Dugin's view, you need to elaborate a set of concepts that replace the whole model of sciences in the West, not just we're anti-Western, but okay, what are you going to do to replace the model of economics and jurisprudence that dominate the liberal episteme, or the liberal way of understanding the world? How are you going to develop new systems of thought? Are you going to incorporate the great thinkers of the 20th century? What are you going to do about Heidegger and Nietzsche? What are you going to do about the great thinkers at the origin of the Western tradition, Plato and Aristotle? So it's no small feat to articulate a conceptual apparatus that a country, a civilization, or anybody else with the power to do so can follow in breaking from the West. It's not a small thing. It's not just like, we're anti-Western suddenly. Oh, okay, well, what are you going to put on the table? So that's the way That's the way I see it. And obviously he has opponents in and out of Russia, not just on the liberal side of the equation, but there are nationalists who don't like they don't like Eurasianism. They think it's too, they want Russia to be narrowly Christian and Slavic. They don't like the sort of, Turkish or other kinds of influences. But this goes way over the heads of most ordinary Western journalists and commentators. There are some anti-Dugin or let's say non-Dugin Western academics who do draw the distinction between the various versions of neo-Eurasianism and stuff, but your typical article about Dugin is
typical
just
Brooklynite.
It's
your typical
it's
Brooklynite
brutal.
article.
I mean, it's brutal in how much it misses. And I have to say, just to wrap up this little tirade here, or at least in my explanation, a polite Canadian tirade. Okay, so one of the things that I think is crucial is that we don't just understand Putin better when we study Dugin. We don't just understand Russia better when we study Dugin. We absolutely understand ourselves better, because his analysis includes an analysis of what it is to be the postmodern West, what the alternatives are that are open to us. And in studying Dugin, we raise the same questions that we must raise in the course of political philosophy. What is a good regime? What should be the centers of power? Who should rule? What's the meaning of history? Is history even the key standard for judgment? So there are many good reasons to read Dugin, and comparatively few not to read him. Oh, he's a Russian fascist. No, he isn't. Okay, he sometimes says some crazy stuff. Yeah, he does. So that can be even interesting at times. When an intelligent person says something crazy, that's more interesting than when an unintelligent person says something crazy. So I think it's better to give him the benefit of the doubt in that case. But people don't, in general, here.
Mark, by the way, I'm going to go on. My camera is going to be muted because I'm going to move to a better lighting place. But Mark, do you have anything to add to Michael's very good presses?
Sure. First of all, I'll just say that I agree with 99-point-something% of what Michael said. So I'll just more fine tune and talk about some other things around because. Like I said, there's very little disagreement in what we are talking about. First of all, let me just say that one of the things Dugin he is much bigger in the Western imagination than he currently is in the Russian. He has, part of the reason for that is he's one of the few Russian thinkers intellectual thinkers who speaks English and is very much trying to engage with a Western audience. And a lot of what is usually...
A quick question. Why does he make the effort to engage with Western audiences?
That's a good question.
He speaks English fluently, as I understand it.
Yeah. He speaks several languages fluently. I mean, little anecdote. He was due to, when I was working with him at MGU, he was due to go to Greece at the time he was trying to make connections with Syriza when they hadn't completely prostituted themselves to the German banks at that point. And he was going to Greece to deliver a speech. And I heard him, practicing it out just before he left. And he says, I said, "You're delivering it in Greek?" And he says, "Yes." And I said, I'm like, "I didn't even know you speak Greek." And I didn't last week. And
he's slow. I get it.
He's a crazy polyglot that way, as he's a genius in so many things. And I wouldn't say that he's fluent in Greek, but he taught himself enough Greek in that time to write and deliver a speech, which is, something that it's those kind of things.
Very few people can do that.
Yeah, I'm you're just in awe of the man in that way. But a lot of what is cited almost whenever the Western media is creating this bogeyman caricatured image of Dugin, right? That presents their idea of the Russian ideologue behind Putin's brain nonsense, is they quote him from the 80s or from the early 90s when he was an anti-communist activist and he was engaged with an intellectual circle that was just going all over the place as long as it was radical, right? And we've all undergone our political evolutions. Mea culpa, I helped run a campaign working with the Democratic Party to try to get John Kerry elected, working with the U.S. Embassy here in Moscow. It's not
okay, get out.
Yeah, I'm not proud of that today, right? I've certainly undergone my political evolution, as I'm sure both of you have.
By the way, another quick parenthesis. How old is Dugin at this time?
Good question. I don't know off the top of my head.
I'll look it up real quick.
In his 60s, I would say. Okay. Yeah, he actually comes from a military family. His father was GRU, actually, I believe.
He's 60 years old, actually, exactly 60.
Yes, 60. Yeah. So
yeah, of course, in the 80s, he'd be in his 20s.
Yeah, he was investigating.
He said all kinds of foolish things.
He was investigating. I mean, and in Europe in general, there is more political and encouragement, especially when you are young, to have more political radicalism, more experimentation than there is in say the U.S., Canada, and the like.
Yeah, and in North America, you're not forgiven. In the Anglo-Saxon world, you're not forgiven if you change your mind. So you're supposed to come out of college with a worldview and paint it with lacquer and be set with it for the rest of your life, which is
instead it's the exact opposite. You're narrowed down into a mold that is presented. Dugin was very much involved in a crazy intellectual circle, and you'll notice that right out of this period, he was briefly involved in the co-founding with Limonov of the National Bolsheviks. Something that he later completely divorced himself from Limonov, from the National Bolsheviks, anything. He also, for a very brief period of time, was very close on the opposite end of the spectrum to the head of KPRF, the Russian Communist Party, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, to their perennial leader, Zhuganov. And it is widely known that he helped write their first major political manifesto. So you can see he was all over the ideological spectrum for quite a time. And when he is cited and he said something crazy and painted as a fascist or something like that, it is almost invariably from this time that he has disavowed, his youthful intellectual discretions. And it's really only in the very late 90s, say 2000, that the Dugin of today started to form what is his core political and philosophical views. Yes. So
he started to coalesce in the 2000s, and that would be understandable considering that the 80s were the period of the Brezhnev and the sort of slow motion collapse of the Soviet Union, and the 90s were the chaos of the post-Soviet period. So that would make complete sense. And so his views started to coalesce in the early 2000s. And so basically here we come to the issue is, what are his views? Does he want Russia to conquer the world? Should my family in Chile start building bunkers in case the Red Army shows up?
Okay, so if you're really interested in Dugin, obviously don't take a few badly placed citations completely out of context that are made into memes and whatnot. Read him yourself, right, and then make up your own minds. And I think if you want to read, say, a trifecta or even 4 of his major works that lay out his thoughts today, and they do it in layers because they all build on each other. Ethnosociology, which Michael translated, which is excellent. It forms a foundation. Then the 4th political theory, which we both worked on separately to basically acknowledge that liberalism, communism, and fascism, the major political systems of modernity, have all failed in one form or another. And he examines and sifts through the debris to find what can be salvaged in attempt to forge a new political theory. And then, because international relations is close to my own heart, more say than the philosophical angle, the theory of a multipolar world, which I think is most relevant to a lot of people that want to understand Dugin's idea of where the world should be moving. Whether it's moving there is another debatable question. And it is, the fourth political theory writ large on an international relations platform, if you will. And then if you wanted to read a fourth, read something that he has written about Heidegger, which goes into greater intellectual detail about the formulation of all of these ideas and how much of a role that Heidegger has played in the creation of the intellectual building blocks that have led up to this big sociology, political science, and then international relations theory trifecta of his.
Michael, would you say that those are the four big books?
Yes, I agree that all of those are crucial. One way that I sometimes configure it, very similarly to what Mark just said, but Dugin has somewhere mentioned that the model he presents, it has sort of three key parts, like body, a soul, and spirit. The body being geopolitics, so his writing on geopolitics. The soul being ethnosociology, so the importance of the study of the ethnos. And the spirit being theology. Now, we haven't really mentioned his books on or studies of theology, but that's something people should keep in mind, and I'll just say it's worth the effort to try to piece together the thoughts on that. And then Heidegger being the core of all of those. But for sure, you'd have to read the fourth political theory, for sure the ethnosociology books. And I agree, theory of a multipolar world has become increasingly relevant because more and more Russian authorities are talking about multipolarity, others are talking about multipolarity. And it's worth understanding what that means for a Dugin, one possible model of multipolarity. So what you get in effect is the idea that the poles of a multipolar world are civilizations, and what it means to study a civilization and to what the project is of asserting civilizational sovereignty on the world stage against the hegemony of Western liberal political modernity. These are crucial. Somehow these are like, they're very basic in the sense that you have no chance of progressing in your understanding of Dugin without them, absolutely. But they're not basic in the sense of being so simple. They're very thoughtful and they require our attention. So for example, theory of a multipolar world, it contrasts Dugin's model with the other major approaches to the study of international relations as an academic discipline. So liberalism, realism, neorealism, neoliberalism, all of those kinds of things. So if anybody listening to this is a student of political science working on international relations, okay, that's like a helpful, as I say, one of the things I don't know that people really recognize, unless like Mark and myself, they have some sort of privileged insight into it, is that he has tried to address academic fields at times on their own terms. And that's true of this international relations book as well. In fact, I translated it, and it was originally from a textbook on international relations that he either had developed or was using when he was teaching at Moscow State University. Yeah, so
Mark, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, I gave him an international relations theory library from my own work at the LSE, and it's when I see theory of a multipolar world, I see so many of the discussions that he and I had at that time period down in print. So I always get this big smile on my face whenever theory of a multipolar world comes up.
Well, I want
fantastic.
yeah. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I was just going to
please.
say it's great. It's it's very nice that Mark and I are together. I think because I've had an outsider's somehow I'm an outsider's insider. I've been translating Dugin for a long time. I'm studying him. I became like a pretty key figure, I think, for the interpretation and presentation of his thought in the West. But without ever having met him personally, and only finally having talked to him when I interviewed him on my channel about philosophy and his work in the theater and stuff like that. And Mark, I know you've been working, alongside him at Moscow State University, and as you just said, helping to develop some of the notions, some of the theories, concretizing it. So it's pretty interesting, to have us here together, seeing it from our different perspectives where there's overlap. And it sounds like mostly, as far as the importance of him as a thinker in these various parts of his thought, there is overlap. Yeah, definitely ethnosociology, theory of a multipolar world, fourth political theory, the Heidegger stuff, which has been really important to me because I did my dissertation on comparative receptions of Heidegger in political theory. And I studied some of Dugin's Heidegger books and have written about them. Heidegger is just generally important, for anybody thinking probably anywhere in the world today, but for sure in the West because of the impact that he made on various schools of political theory. So it's just another way Dugin enters the conversation. Like, oh, here's a different way of interpreting Heidegger than what we're used to. Let's see if there's something there.
Michael, you mentioned that he had done some theater work.
Yeah, so I didn't know the full details, but he gave a series of lectures. And again, it's mostly for the Russian speakers this stuff is available because there's just not enough hands on deck to translate everything from the Russian. But he did work with MKAT, I guess, a theater, Moscow theater, on ontology of the theater, where he took his teachings about Apollo, Dionysus, and Cybele, these three logoi from another series of books he's written, and used them to analyze, the phenomenon of the theater and to sort of argue for the possibility of a new renaissance of the dramatic arts. So this is just a part of his work that is as little as people in the West know even the basics of his thought. I think this is like less unknown, less known than even that. But yeah, he did some theater work. I asked him about it in my interview. So all of it is in the spirit of the following type of reflection. Modernity reconfigured our lives. It pushed mysticism and certain forms of religiosity and an attitude towards myth and tragic theater and other kinds of things out of the center of our existence. And it replaced it with a kind of narrow rationalism, narrow utilitarianism, narrow scientism, and so on. But if we believe that we've come to the end of modernity and entered into a postmodern era, or if for some other reason we're rejecting modernity, then suddenly everything modernity cast aside is back on the table, both pre-modern and postmodern. And that means the revisitation of crucial myths, archaic figures, and including, the possibility of a renaissance of the theater. So that's there. Yeah. And you can see maybe as far as the meme students of Dugin, the people who just know Dugin from the memes of Dugin, when he was doing his work in the theater, you could see like images of him on stage surrounded by 12 nymphs or whatever, and he's standing there, so people can find the nymph, the nymph meme version of his theater work. But I would recommend for anybody who's trying to poke around on the serious side, Mark, maybe you know other sources, but for me, the key source is paidauma.tv. Now, it used to be that Dugin had all of his lectures on YouTube until YouTube kicked them off, which was a pretty big inconvenience, not only for him, but for the people studying him. But yeah, if you go to Paideuma, PAIDEUMA.tv, all of his lectures are there on these topics.
But why did YouTube kick him off?
Partially, I'm sure, because of the sanctions regime, partially because maybe they had the government just push down on him, pressure him. I know his books on some book retailers, you can get his books. Amazon has had them yanked for a long time. But I'll tell you, when his channel and his Twitter was canned, and Mark, maybe you know the detail, Facebook was for a while and he was taken down. But the YouTube attack on him, in my view, was a big blow to Russia scholars, because when he started linking to the news site, it was unwatchable because it was just too slow. You pull up a video on YouTube and it's there for you instantly. You pull up a YouTube 2 years ago on paidauma.tv and I was waiting like 24 hours to load 10 minutes. It became unworkable. So for anybody who was trying to understand or doing research or scholarship, that really sucked. And for him, his reach, that sucked.
The point I'm saying is that in this conversation so far, what you guys are saying, you're describing a thinker that in terms of controversy would be like, I don't know, Jung. Nobody would think seriously of yanking Jung from YouTube if there were like lectures of him or whatnot. Why is he radioactive insofar as his
look?
Thinking?
He's seen. I'll just say one word here, Mark, and then he's seen as a living. So not all great thinkers are alive, right? Mm-hmm. Living inspiration for a now present and active anti-Western regime. So in other words, when you see that there's a hot war at stake and it's inspired directly, indirectly, related directly, indirectly, reflecting directly, indirectly, the thoughts of a living thinker, it just becomes too hot to handle. Even for people who say that they're interested, even for people who do whatever they do, free speech, free inquiry, learn about other civilizations, other peoples, hot war, living thinker, that was one of the big reasons they put him under sanctions, and they put his daughter under sanctions, and they tried to shut up not only him by pulling off YouTube, not only the circulation of his books by yanking them off Amazon, but even people working on him like myself, effectively blacklisted from academia for my work on him, not for the quality of my work on him, for the fact of my work on him. So that was kind of network warfare against the possibility of learning about a genuine anti-liberal alternative.
So basically, you're saying that liberalism got to a point that it got scared of its own shadow. I mean, we're talking about a guy who's, I mean, he's not advocating, cannibalizing small babies or anything like that. I mean, he's a thinker on various issues, just as respectable as anybody else. And the fact that
but listen,
Michael,
it doesn't even matter if he was talking about, what did Sam Harris say recently, right? I don't care if Hunter Biden had corpses of dead children in his basement. So it doesn't even matter if Dugin was saying you should cannibalize young children, but he had the politically correct opinion on liberalism's dominance, then they would forgive him anything, just like Sam Harris was prepared to forgive Hunter Biden anything. So doesn't even have to do with the extent of the crime. It has to do with the nature of his orientation. And right-wing anti-liberalism automatically off the table. And he's not even, that's my shorthand version of getting into Dugin's thought, right-wing anti-liberalism. It's obviously much more than that. But there's no chance. If you're not in the liberal Orthodox mainstream, and for the most part, you're not on the left, you're just dehumanized, demonized, and as much as possible denied the ability to share your thoughts.
Mark, would you agree with what Michael said?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we know that these big tech giants, right, whether it's YouTube, Google, Facebook, right, Meta, Twitter, they're owned part and parcel by people who are intimately involved with the U.S. national security state. The revolving door between the State Department and the top figures within these corporations is huge. And the number of people that have been brought on by them to basically curate information. They're, quote, disinformation specialists. They're right out of the U.S. and the British national security state. Read Julian Assange's book, Google Is Not What It Seems, because he really got a huge insight into what is going on there.
Can you give us a little breakdown?
Sure. I mean, the big thing is the synergy between these big tech platforms and the U.S. and to a slightly lesser extent the British governments. And at some point they actually came to him and they basically tried to recruit him. They tried to suborn him, to co-opt him onto their side.
Oh, what did they offer? Did you say?
Yeah, I mean, basically like an amnesty and everything. This was when he was still in the UK before he went into the embassy. So anyway, read the book. There's also a short form. There was an article, I believe it was even published. Was it Newsweek? I can't remember off the top of my head, but he wrote an article that is a short form of that book that is still online. Again, Google Is Not What It Seems. So read into that. So yeah, I mean, Dugin is anti-Western and anti-liberal from a state that is actively challenging U.S. hegemony and is seen as not just a military threat, but is presenting other ideas as well. And Russia is kind of finding itself at this point. Remember, in the West, philosophy is dead, right? Philosophy is over. The end of history was already declared. Liberalism won. There's
1992. I remember it.
There's not any further discussion to be had. Philosophy is not important in Western academia, or the funnel that goes from academia into the seats of power, be it political or corporate. So Dugin's focus on philosophy, that alone already puts him out there in something that is just to be dismissed, right? And then when you toss in the anti-Western, anti-liberal nature of it, then he becomes toxic. Then he becomes poisonous. And he creates this very convenient caricature bogeyman to paint Russia. And one slight area where I think that Michael and I have a little bit of difference, although I think he presented a very nuanced view of that, is Dugin's influence. But since 2000, Dugin has been very much kind of a Cassandra figure, that he has tapped into not just a zeitgeist, because he tapped into it before it was the zeitgeist, but he saw geopolitically and geoculturally the direction that Russia needed to move in to be independent from the West since the early 2000s, at least. Again, I won't attest to Dugin's work before that. I don't agree with much of it. But after that period, he set on that course there. But I do not believe that Putin has ever read anything Dugin wrote. I don't think he's ever seriously listened to anything Dugin has ever said. I know for a fact that he has never met, or they've never met or spoken, at least up until Dugin's daughter was assassinated, a couple weeks ago. And Putin started out as a very, very different political creature. He was pro-Western. I mean, literally. Yeah. I mean, he tried to integrate Russia into the West with just a remotest element of, some type of foreign policy agency, some respect for Russia's interests. He tried multiple times. He tried to bring Russia into NATO, for Christ's sake. And very much Putin was a bit of a German romanticist because of the time that he spent working there in the KGB. And he had a very, I think, naive conception of Europe. I think he really believed that separating Europe from the United States, or at least, a degree of remove, was possible for years. Putin has only in the last few years fallen into what Dugin has been pointing to for a long period of time. And we know who Dugin's foundational thinkers are. He's very open with it, right? It's Ivan Ilyin, it's Berdyaev, it's these classical Russian thinkers that Putin has actually read and have influenced them, but have also had an influence on Dugin, right? And when you talk about Dugin's unique intellectual pedigree, first of all, Eurasianism is not Dugin, right? Dugin is a Eurasianist, but there is a rich and varied school of Eurasianism that differs, say, more than different liberal theories or even realist thinkers might think, that stretches from the 1920s and their foundations, up until today. My dissertation that I did that brought me to Dugin's notice was I wrote about the Eurasianism specifically of Alexander Panarin, who was a contemporary Eurasianist of Dugin in the 90s. He was actually head of political science at MGU at the time. And Panarin came from a more left pedigree.
Sorry to interrupt, Mark. I want to ask you, if you don't mind, can you explain for the chat so that everybody's on the same page? What is Eurasianism? What's the tenet of it? What's the idea behind it?
Okay, so, I mean, it's kind of a descendant of Slavophile and even Byzantine Russian and philosophical thought, political philosophy, in a way. And it came about by a number of intellectual emigres during the time immediately after the Russian Revolution, right? So we're talking the 1920s. And they examined, at first they were, of course, very critical of the revolution, and then they came to kind of maybe what they're doing is not so bad as long as it's temporary, because they believed that Russia needed to separate itself, not just politically, but culturally and spiritually from the West, and in a way to find its own inner orient, right? To look to the East, but particularly its own inner East, to the Central Asian states, to what are today the Central Asian states, to the Caucasus, and needed to focus inward rather than that West-leaning Russian intellectual tradition that, say, started with Peter the Great, really kicked off there. And they came to terms in their own way with recognizing that the Soviet Union was providing a degree of insulation of intellectual isolation from Russia, from the West. And there are a number of Eurasianist thinkers. Some of them are a little
but why did they want to detach from the West? Did they see where the West was going and they wanted to be part of it?
Yeah.
Or was it something else?
No, that was it. I mean,
in the 1920s, they saw things going on in the West that they want to know part of?
I mean, there's already a tradition of Western thoughts that have rebelled against the direction of, that led from Enlightenment to the Renaissance to modernity. And I mean, Spengler, of course, is one of those, principal Western thinkers, that was working on I would say a parallel course to the Russian Eurasianists. But definitely they on a political, on a philosophical, on a spiritual level, they wanted separated from the West. They maybe weren't as fiercely anti-Western geopolitically as Dugin, right? That is something that has come about due to events and where we've taken us, right?
Sure.
But Panarin that I worked on, he come from a more left intellectual pedigree, where Dugin, he was back and forth, but I think he's more in the right direction. But towards Panarin died in the end of the 90s, but towards the end of their lives, Panarin's life, they actually started talking to each other and finding much more similarity in where they were, increasingly intersecting in formulating, Eurasianism moving forward.
Panarin being more on the left and Dugin being more on the right.
It's complicated.
More.
I mean,
all of these, all of this is it's oversimplification, left, right. But I get your point. And so the Eurasianism is basically the notion, and I'm just trying to repeat to flesh it out. Is the notion that Russia should detach from the West, focus more towards Asia, Central Asia. Where does China come into play in all this? Is China part of this Eurasianism, or is it like a separate entity?
No. I mean, I think most people recognize that China is its own huge civilizational epicenter, right?
Of course.
And no one. Dugin actually in the 80s, he was very into the 90s was very anti-China, but the geopolitical situation was very quite different at the time from what it is now. And now he recognizes China as the partner civilization, perhaps even with Iran, that is, supposed to or should give birth to a multipolar world, because they're the big centers of civilizational resistance to Western hegemony. But
can I understand something? And correct me if I'm wrong. The whole notion of Dugin and the notion of multipolarity, it's not just a reactionary rejection of the West, but rather a deliberate creation of a Russian Eurasianist kind of conceptual model and civilizational goals, right?
Sure.
And so, what are those civilizational goals that Dugin is espousing? What does he see as the Russian state and the Russian people that is against the West, but going in its own direction, going towards something? Because there's a great difference between hating something and wanting to get away from it, and striving towards something where you have an ideal, which is, of course, it's much more powerful. And so that's why I'm curious to understand. What does Dugin see? Is he dangling as the objective to strive for, if you will?
Yeah, I think that actually that is part of the difference. One of the big things that Dugin has brought to Eurasianism that is unique to his political thoughts is traditionalism with a capital T, right? Not traditional with a lowercase t, and he has brought this more spiritual aspect to it. That is unique to Dugin, right? No other Eurasianist really developed in that direction before. So that is something that is uniquely Dugin's. Civilizational theory of international relations and its meta, it extends into several different disciplines. It's not new. Samuel Huntington was brilliant. I don't care what anyone says. And yeah, he created a grand theory, and there's all kinds of holes in it because it is a grand theory. but he's hardly the only one. And there is a whole course of very quietly international relations scholars in the West who have also developed, their own civilizational work on international relations theory. And I think they're worth reading, even if you don't take everything on board. Katzenstein, working as an editor of several different thinkers, Civilizations and World Politics, Plural and Pluralist Perspectives, is it's a 3-volume work. And I think that's an excellent intro into how even in the West, people have started to take a look at civilizations and, as a more an agent in international relations theory rather than just the Westphalian nation state model.
Michael? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Michael, what's your perspective on Dugin's Eurasianism?
Well, I would just add a couple of things, which is that terminologically, there's a version of Eurasianism that concerns just Russia, so to speak. Mm-hmm. It's like a native ideology for Russia. But there's also a sense of Eurasianism as a more general political theory. So sometimes Dugin says that explicitly. Sometimes he just says it in passing. And sometimes he marks them with a different name. So the fourth political theory is sometimes the more general version. And Neo-Eurasianism is sometimes the more specifically Russian version.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's helpful just for people to see that, at least for Dugin, it's not an ideology only for Russia. It generalizes into a political theory that can be used or that can be thought through anywhere. Okay, so there can be in some sense, there can be like a Western Eurasianist if he feels himself to be closer to the political theory of Eurasianism, even if he's not related physically or geopolitically to Eurasia as a domain, as a landscape or whatever the case is. So the other thing that I wanted to mention about, yes, Mark's absolutely right that Dugin stands in a tradition and in several traditions. One, carrying out the work of the original Eurasianists, but also for sure his work on Carl Schmitt, Martin Heidegger, the traditionalists, Evola and Guénon, as well as, I would say, a tradition of Russian religious thought, Russian mystical thought, Solovyov and other people that Westerners may or may not know much about. So Dugin for sure situates himself in a variety of traditions, and he somehow tries to distill. Remember I said at the start that he's a comprehensive thinker in my view. So he tends to try to cast a comprehensive glance over the traditions that he works within, and then to distill something that is common to them and usable in a new format. So he himself had said, to introduce another terminological distinction, if we call the 1920s thinkers the Eurasianists, Dugin sometimes uses the term Neo-Eurasianism. So it's Eurasianism plus something which makes it new. Well, what's the plus? He himself said the theories of the geopoliticians like Mackinder and so on, the theories of Schmitt and Heidegger, work by Jung, sociology of the imagination, Gilbert Durand, all of these other traditions that stand between 1920 and 2020, so to speak, he fills in, supplements the original insights of the first or early Eurasianists in order to produce a workable intellectual model for today. So those are just a few things like Neo-Eurasianism versus Eurasianism, Eurasianism as applied just to Russia versus as more general. Those are some of the things I would say about that. In terms of the civilizational aspect, this also is a rich question because he has a 24-volume book series called Noomachia, which is, as I would call it, a philosophical analysis of civilizational multipolarity. So there are many civilizations. How do you study them? What does it mean to study a civilization philosophically? Well, he has a model, and he applies that model to the various civilizations over the course of, as I say, 24 volumes.
Okay,
so it depends on how deep, exactly. It depends on how deep a person wants to go into what he sees as the heart and soul of a civilization, as its mission, as its task in the world, the civilizational being in the world. So in the Theory of a Multipolar World book that we mentioned earlier, he says there are at least 13 different approaches to the study of civilization. Like you can study the way they educate people, you can study their cultural codes, you can do a linguistic analysis, existential analysis, you can treat it as a subject, as a process, so he's pretty interested in the question, how can we articulate the unique original existence of a civilization as fully as it deserves to be articulated in a way that gives us both understanding and something to work with on a policy level. I think one of the reasons why he has readers in places like Brazil, China, Iran, and all of that is because they have a sense of themselves as a great civilization that has had to take a knee before Western hegemony and that are looking for resources more general somehow than their own like texts, you see. So they have to they realize they have a rich tradition, but they also need this sort of, as it were, philosophical foundations on which to offer a defense of their civilization, not only in its own terms, okay, but somehow also more generally. So he has said, I love this when I read it, that he said, you know, I go to Iran and I have great conversations there with the political leadership on the basis of the shared relevance of Heidegger that we, you know, and other things like that, other topics like that. So this thinking civilizationally, listen, whether people like or don't like Russia, like or don't like Dugin, okay, whatever, we have these options before us. We can begin to take civilizations into account. Mark gave an example of how some international relations scholars are doing that, himself included. We can begin, therefore, to raise the question, what is a civilization? How does it affect the way we think, act, remember, you know, all of these kinds of things. And then we have a whole new set of tasks laid out before us. Dugin has done some of the work about these 24 volumes, by the way, which you can imagine, okay? I have one here to show you. This is the methodological volume, one of the first two methodological volumes, okay? So imagine 24 of these stacked side by side, roughly.
I've got them up here.
Yeah, so this is a really serious
if you can move the camera, Mark, show it. Yeah, we'd be great to see it.
What I wanted to say is Dugin himself has said these 24 volumes are basically just the table of contents for the real work that you have to do to understand civilizational plurality. That's some respect for other civilizations. Yeah. Here's what it's like to have no respect for other civilizations. Oh, you're not Western, then you're not human. That's pretty much the default over here. So you have two extremes. You have that reductive extreme, or you have the extreme that treats 24 volumes as a table of contents. People have to find themselves along the spectrum, you know? And it's a sort of a reality check where you find yourself there. My view, Mark's view, I'm sure, you know, it's worth studying these other civilizations. It's worth it independently of politics, and it's also hugely relevant politically. So people have to decide. If they think no, then, you know, they have to live with the world that they're making or that they're destroying.
Michael, you know, I want to ask you something, because here we have two perspectives, radically different perspectives on the same man. You, Michael, you've never met Dugin, or have you? Oh, no, you have.
Yeah, besides having interviewed him once on my channel, which was a long time after I started my work on him. About 10 years
but you started your work and a big chunk of it, never having met the man or interacted with him. Whereas you, Mark,
that's right.
You got to Moscow and that's how you met him and you started interacting with him. So I'm very curious to understand, Michael, your perspective as to what was it about his work that drew you in. Because you know, Mark has mentioned in private, had mentioned some anecdotes. I'd love for you, Mark, to tell them again to our audience. But I'm interested, Michael, in what was it that that touched you, that made you think, this is a guy I really want to pay attention to? I mean, you obviously must have had that, or else you wouldn't have translated his work and done such a deep dive into it, right?
Yeah, so this was just a weird coincidence of accidents that all sort of struck at exactly the right moment. So I had an interest in mysticism, an interest in Russian theology and Russian thought, and an interest in political philosophy, like Plato's Republic and the Philosopher King. Okay, so I had these three crucial elements that were claiming my attention. Again, Russian uniqueness, mystical thought, and the political king, the Philosopher King of the Republic. And then I read an article in a neoconservative journal that's now defunct called Azure, Ideas for the Jewish Nation. And there was an article about Dugin there called Prophet of a New Russian Empire. And basically, I wasn't looking into Russia. I wasn't looking into Dugin. I was reading this journal for unrelated reasons. Actually, I was learning more about Leo Strauss, one of the great teachers of the history of political philosophy and a major influence on me personally. So I came across this article, first time I'd ever heard of Dugin, and I start reading it, and it says Dugin had been kicked out of Ukraine at the time that this was written because his Eurasian youth movement was doing
What year was this roughly?
I think it was probably 2000. What year was it written, or what year was I reading it? I was reading it as an undergraduate, probably around 2011, and it must have been written 2009 or so. Okay. And right in the first paragraph or so, what it said is that the Ukrainians had kicked Dugin out of the country, and in response, the Kremlin had expelled the Ukrainian ambassador to Russia. And I'm like, okay, wow, why does the Kremlin have the back of this philosopher? That's pretty interesting. So this was, I'm not claiming that any of this is true or not true. I'm telling you what I saw in the article, what resonated for me. So it was like, okay, he was presented as a philosopher who had some backing or some, like, the state cared about him, was interested in him. Okay, so sort of the philosopher king check mark was added. Then it said he had been in these circles, occult, mystical, okay, that he had some interest in the hidden things and in sort of, let's say, Dionysian aspects of knowledge and understanding. So that appealed to me. That was interesting. And it also said that he somehow crystallizes the zeitgeist and the Russian self-understanding. I'm basically almost quoting here verbatim from memory. If you want to understand Russia today, you have to read Dugin, something along those lines. So I had my political philosopher, I had the mysticism, I had the Russian soul, Russian specificity. My interest was piqued. At that time, about 2011, I Googled him. And the first thing that came up was a 5-minute talk on this idea of the fourth political theory, where it basically said 20th century was a war of ideologies, liberalism, communism, and fascism. Communism was defeated. You had the bipolar Cold War world, liberalism versus communism. Communism fell. You had liberalism, the last ideology standing. And if you want to be neither liberal nor communist nor fascist, you can't be unless you declare the space of a fourth political theory. Okay, that was about his 5-minute talk in 30 seconds. I heard that and I thought, that checks out actually, because my experience as an undergraduate student at the time was that if you're not a liberal and you're not on the left, by default, you're called a fascist. So I thought, well, hey, that sort of captures it, right? People can't seem to think outside of those categories. Dugin just explained why. He's opening up the space for thinking. Yeah, I'm on board. That's pretty interesting. That's resonating. So then I continued my Googling. I found him on Wikipedia. I went to the Russian Wikipedia, which is not identical to the English one. It definitely wasn't at the time. Now I assume there's a big difference as well. And I went through, even then he had like 20, 30 publications, 20, 30 books or however many. And one of them was called The Fourth Political Theory. So I had just heard a lecture on the topic. And, I see he's got a book on the topic. So I was interested in translating Russian philosophy into English, because one of the things about philosophy, Gonzalo, I know you have a background in it, you may know, and some of the people watching and listening may know, technical terms are important in philosophy. Okay, there are technical terms, and the translation of those technical terms is relevant, like from Greek to Latin, and so on, from Latin to German, whatever the case happens to be. So I thought, okay, I'm interested in Russian philosophy. I'm going to translate a Russian philosopher and get a handle on the technical philosophical terminology in translation. Like, how do you translate substance, essence, this, that, and the other thing. And I was asked to find a contemporary Russian philosopher. And since I had just put these connections together, I thought, okay, I'll translate this guy, Alexander Dugin. He's seems like a philosopher, right? He was presented as one in the article. He's got interesting things to say about political philosophy. So my supervisor agreed. I started translating him, and it was just like so relevant, so rich, so interesting, better than most of what I was learning in my classes. And the more I started poking around and learning, just the more intriguing it became. He's a good lecturer, in my opinion. I watched his lectures at Moscow State University when they were available online, and they're really compelling. And with no disrespect to the teachers I liked, his lectures were often much more profound, more comprehensive and deeper. So, it was off to the races. Oh, I guess one of the key moments I should add is that my supervisor at one point said, and Mark, this is where our fates begin to intertwine. He said, have you ever thought about getting this published? Or ever thought about reaching out to Dugin to get this published? And, as like an undergraduate student, it had never crossed my mind. It wasn't in the cards. I was just learning something basically for myself here. And he's like, you should reach out to Dugin and see about getting it published. And off we go from that point on. The connection with Arctos that had been putting something together for publication, the compilation of what I had done and what Mark had done, the publication in July 2012 of the Fourth Political Theory book. And then I just continued. What can I say? Some things I translated I had to do under a pseudonym because, believe it or not, you would think if you're contributing to an academic discipline as a student that you should be somehow like when Socrates had to say what his punishment should be, he said he should be rewarded. So, as a graduate or undergraduate student doing these translations, I felt the same way. I should be rewarded rather than punished, but the heat was too hot. So some of the geopolitics books, one I translated pseudonymously, but that's not the point. This was the connection of interests. You see, again, this is for me personally. This isn't going to apply to everybody, but some people will resonate, I think. When you find a thinker who has a kind of divine madness to him, so what does it mean, divine madness? It means there's been some sort of break with the ordinary course of affairs. And this break with the ordinary course of affairs has given you some privileged perspective on human life in its totality, okay? Those kinds of figures, liminal figures, Dionysian figures, however you want to see it, I have always been attracted to them, various mystics of the different traditions and things like that. And it's pretty clear to me that Dugin can articulate that world better than people who have no inkling of it. And therefore, for that reason alone, he was interesting to me, totally independently of the Russia thing. But the Russia just adds to what makes it so fascinating. Like his contemporary relevance does, I mean. So my view is that when we talked about him being a great thinker, my view, again, I don't know, Mark, you may see it differently. Gonzalo, you may see it differently. My view is that if he wasn't relevant for contemporary Russia at all, he would still have made a valuable contribution to some serious disciplines, philosophy, phenomenology, that kind of thing. The fact that he is relevant just adds to what it means to think philosophically about politics today. So it's helpful, but it's not like it's the sole valuable ingredient.
So, Michael, from what you're telling me, it would imply, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Dugin really is head and shoulders like the big brain in Russian intellectual life at this time. Would that be accurate?
Again, I have to clarify that. I have a tunnel vision when it comes to Russian intellectuals. I don't study Russian intellectuals in general. There are very intelligent academics, I'm sure, working in every field, publishing books and articles, including public intellectuals and private intellectuals. So in no way do I mean to reduce all of Russia's intellectual richness and profundity, whatever it happens to be, to the figure of Dugin. But I work with tunnel vision. When Leo Strauss, the scholar of the history of political thought, became important to me, that go down that rabbit hole and go all the way down it. And same with Dugin. When Dugin became important to me, go down that rabbit hole all the way. So he belongs among the great thinkers today and among the great Russian thinkers, but I don't claim he's the only one. And anybody who's mentioning other people should be, everybody should have their spot, so to speak.
And so, Mark, let me ask you, I mean, you have a personal connection with Dugin, but I'll ask you the same question. Is Dugin head and shoulders the big brain in Russian intellectual thought?
No, nothing's further from the truth. Nothing's further from the truth.
Please elaborate.
Yeah, Dugin is a marginal figure in Russian intellectual and political circles. He should not be. He should be. I believe someday in the future he will be recognized as a great Russian political thinker. But at least and I think after the death of his daughter, there will be renewed interest into him. Sure. But up until, say, this year, I would say that Dugin has become more important as a multipolar thinker than he has on the current Russian political and intellectual scene.
Before we continue, Mark, could you, because you've told me the story, but I'd ask for the audience. You came to know Dugin personally and worked with him and talked with him and helped him develop ideas. How did that happen? Can you, without, I don't want to like dox you or be indiscreet, but I just for the sake of the audience, if you could tell us how you came to meet him. I mean, you're a gringo, right? How the hell did you wind up being, drinking buddies with Dugin?
Okay, first of all,
I'm teasing.
No. I have some Russian and Slavic mutt roots, right? Russian, some Slovak, and
well, I thought Sloboda was Anglo-Saxon from Birmingham or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's from Mississippi, right? No,
I'm right here, by the way. I'm just moving.
Yeah. My wife is Crimean. She's actually from what was once Ukraine, and sometime we met in Boston, and I followed her back to Russia, kind of aimless at that point, having recently got out of the military, and then spent a few years working in Boston. So I ended up in Russia, in Moscow. And at some point, I started utilizing my GI Bill to go back and study something other than nuclear engineering. And I started studying international relations and security theory. And at some point, my wife, who is a communist marketing director,
Okay.
yeah, politically, she's a KPRF. She's a communist, but she lives in the real world, so she's a marketing director. And she got an offer to go to what was then her then company's global headquarters in London, and she's like, "Well, can you transfer your studies from Moscow State to there?" And I'm like, "Well, let me see," and I could actually, as it turns out, and I ended up at LSE. The London School of Economics and Political Science, where I finished up my postgraduate work. And my dissertation was on the Eurasianism of Alexander Panarin as a challenge to the clash of civilizations of Samuel Huntington and Fukuyama's End of History. And somehow Dugin got wind of it. And I don't even know how the hell he got a copy of it. I certainly haven't shown it to that many people because I'd be embarrassed of it today. But he's like, "Well, hey, how about you come to Moscow State and work with me?" And I'm like, "Yeah," because I was already heading back to Russia. I had never intended to stay long term in London, and we were going back, and I was like, "Yes, please," and so that's how I ended up in the sociology faculty working with Dugin, and I'd like to think that I brought a lot of current international relations thought to his desk, and we had a lot of great conversations, and I came to Dugin from Russia, geopolitics, and Eurasianism. So a completely different intellectual, area of Dugin's many overlapping intellectual endeavors than Michael did. But I gained an appreciation for the philosophical and political philosophical fields that I never had before through my association with Dugin.
What's he like as a man? I'm very curious about this.
He's extremely soft-spoken. He is a real intellectual. He wants to engage you in a intellectual discussion immediately. He wants to try to find what things that you have in common, and then he'll work from there to take a look at where you disagree, and try to re-examine it from a different angle. And it's infuriating at times how nice and how focused he is on intellectual discourse that way. Because I come from an American political tradition where if I see someone who I consider to be my intellectual or political rivals, I want to mix it up. Right? I want crossfire. I want heated words, right? I want boiling blood. And Dugin, despite the image of him as some type of fire-breathing, rhetorician or something, Rasputin, reborn, could not be further from the opposite. He will try to have a quiet discussion with you. I mean, he's had civil discussions with Zbigniew Brzezinski and Bernard Henry Levy. Right?
Yeah, I saw a picture of him, of Dugin with Anthony Blinken, of all people.
Yeah, Anthony Blinken. Yeah. He's that kind of guy. He can have an intellectual discussion with anyone who is capable of intellectual thought. And if you're not, he will at least try to then to educate you. He's so unassuming in that way, in that he does not go out of his way to force his view on you or insist that he's correct. And he frequently comes to the realization that he's wrong. He politically evolves and intellectually, I assume, all the time, right? So, I mean, even his views of geopolitics have changed dramatically from the 1980s. I wanted to mention a bit about where I separated from Dugin.
Yeah.
Yeah, because around I was working with him at Moscow State University, and one of the big things that he pushes is, his crusade against the West, which I think is entirely correct. But I came to a disagreement in methodology with him. There was a time, say early 2013, when he was doing a lot of outreach to radical political groups and movements in Europe and the United States.
That would include his trip to Greece, for instance.
Greece, right? Some figures on the far left, Syriza, other examples there, but also some figures on the radical right, where he tried to reach out to the Golden Dawn in Greece, to Jobbik in Hungary, to the National Front in France, and to some people that I personally find abominable in the United States, like, Richard Spencer actually tried to make contact with him, and I said no, I would not introduce them. I wouldn't talk to, I wouldn't have nothing to do with them. And I don't think Richard ever met Dugin because of that. But
he met David Duke, for instance.
That was before, but it's along the same line. Now, you have to understand his rationale for doing this. Not, first of all, right-left does not apply to Dugin, just like the reductionist Western political politics of center-right versus center-left rarely applies to the rest of the world, politically speaking. Right? And it certainly doesn't apply to Russian politics, and it doesn't apply to Dugin in particular. So there are some avenues of his thought that are far to the left, and some that would be considered far right. But some of the people that he was reaching out to, I thought, were not just toxic intellectually or politically, but also toxic in that the taint of them could ruin his message to other people. And he was doing it from the rationale that they are supporting extremist politics in Russia and Ukraine. So doing the opposite back is just fair game, right? Adopting, the same tactics, not necessarily because he agreed with everyone, right? With the Golden Dawn or whatsoever, but it was a tactic, right, to create instability, to forge, at his own intellectual level. Again, no relation to policy in Russia or anything like that. But I thought this was wrong, again, for the reasons I've already said. Some of them, the National Front in France, the way they are under Le Pen, in many ways, her economics are more left than the current, than Macron, right?
They are, actually.
And so the National Front, I had no problem with, right? Jobbik is a complicated bag in Hungary. There's some people, so what I would consider from my, political perspective to be good people and some not good people. Okay, gray line. Golden Dawn, Richard Spencer, that type of racists in the United States, not helpful. And then he also was working with some people in Ukraine. And in particular, there was a few meetings, but in particular, there was a traditionalist conference just outside Moscow where there were a number of people from Europe and Ukraine, from different traditionalist perspectives, but particularly some of the people that came from Ukraine. I met and I talked with them. And I came back to Dugin and I said, these people are actual real fascists. And I'm like, I don't think we should be working with them, right? I don't think that it's helpful. And I explained my reasons why, and he had nice political, yes, you're right. And then, of course, he went on and continued with this. And I just want to point out who a couple of those, and that at that point, I disagreed enough methodologically that I said, okay, I respect the hell out of you. I agree with you on so much, but I think that this is toxic reputationally, and it's wrong. And I just need to create a degree of separation, right? And soon after that, the way events turned out, he was fired by the Putin administration. They put pressure to have him kicked out of Moscow State University, which shows the idea that he has some type of influence. I mean, Can
you expand on that a little bit? Why was he kicked out specifically? What did the Kremlin object to?
Sure. Let me go back just a second to there.
Sure.
To some of the people I met there that I thought we should not be working with. One of them is Elena Semenyaka. She is now the intellectual secretary and the ideologue for Azov.
Oh, okay.
First, she was with Right Sector, then she went to Azov. One of the people that I met at a speech that Dugin gave in Copenhagen. Copenhagen, was the neo-Nazi Michael Skillet, who then went and became part of the Ukrainian military, and is still there to this day that I know. And these are the type of reasons that I said I think your methodology of doing back to them to destabilize them by outreaching with these political groups is wrong. And I think I've been proved right in that regard. Yeah. Particularly.
Oh, by the way, sorry, a quick parentheses, but somebody's asking here in chat. It's a good question. Did he had an interaction with E. Michael Jones?
I don't know that person. I don't know everything. Yeah.
Don't worry about it.
So anyway, mid-time 2013, before things broke out in Ukraine, I said, all right, we're still, have some contact and everything, but I need to separate. I think I can elucidate as a pundit and an academic some of your ideas better to a Western audience at this point, if I'm not directly associated with you, because I think you're going. I think
I'll be able to push your ideas better if we're not friends.
Yes, because I thought where he was going, methodologically. Again, it was all done through they're doing it to us with the support of these ultra nationalists in Ukraine.
When you talk about methodology,
the nationalist Alexei Navalny.
When you're talking about methodology, you're talking about the political approach, the actual on-the-ground political approach that he was taking. That's
I'm talking about his outreach to far right.
You're not talking about methodological.
No, not intellectual. The political methodology.
Yeah, the outreach. Yeah.
So then things kicked off in Ukraine and went the way that they went. And Dugin was particularly strident then, demanding a Russian intervention, which I agreed with completely in 2014. And at the same time, particularly after the Odessa massacre, when these anti-Maidan activists in Ukraine were burned alive in the trade union center.
Despicable.
Yeah. By, these nascent battalions, neo-Nazi, the Banderite fascist battalions, again, which unfortunately some of the people he had been outreaching to Ukraine were already, well involved in this there. So he then said some things that have been completely distorted and taken out of context, where he talked about the type of Ukrainians, of off the Maidan who have done this to these people in Odessa, to these other Ukrainians, right? Because they were all Ukrainian citizens, are crawled up from the gutter. They're not part of the great tradition of the Ukrainian people, and they should be wiped out. And he said, kill, kill, kill. And that was completely distorted and misinterpreted, through the Western media as a call for Russian genocide of Ukraine. It is not what was said, and anyone who really looks at the records there, but it got a lot of bad publicity at a time that the Kremlin, particularly under the influence of a presidential advisor, Surkov, was pushing the Minsk Accords as a political reconciliation so that it would not end up in a complete separation from the West. And Dugin became a big political embarrassment to the Kremlin. He had no effect on policy. He was completely kept at a remove from anyone in any position of power in the country. But it was already
he was politically sacrificed then.
Yeah,
because
he was,
even because it just to give the appearance by the Kremlin, give the appearance that they were not aligned with what he was interpreted as having said.
Despite, I mean, they're saying, "Oh, this is Putin's brain," and they're like, "No, here he's gone from Moscow State University, and he is informally banned from all state media."
So basically, I mean, if I understand you correctly, and I'm sorry for the bad lighting, but I'm here on my terrace to smoke a cigarette or several cigarettes. The notion of tagging Dugin as Putin's brain was really a Western political move so as to identify these out of context and perhaps unwise comments, tag them to Putin.
Yes,
is that basically what you're saying?
Yes, and things that he had again done in the 80s and 90s and his youthful intellectual
just
stage.
to add fuel to the fire.
All to add fuel to the fire there. Yeah,
it's sort of like if somebody said that I don't know, Trump is what's his name? Richard Spencer is Trump's brain. You'd be like, what are you talking about? But you realize that it's a smear, right? Yes,
it's a smear. It's a sphere writ large. So he was actually banned. He had been a feature of Russian political talk shows, like Sunday political talk shows, as a kind of often as an agent provocateur or so forth. But he had been kicked off of those after this. And the only thing for years that he appeared in was this orthodox, traditional private channel of a businessman. It's not really correct to call him an oligarch because he didn't actually have any political influence, but Tsargrad, where he briefly became the chief editor and then had his own show and so forth. But he wasn't on Russian TV for years after that because of this. So the Kremlin actually went out of their way to marginalize him even further than he already was, largely due for the West trying to link them falsely together. So that's why I say that he has really been a pretty marginal figure in Russian political life and in the intellectual life. Young Russian university students, they don't read Dugin. They don't talk about what Dugin wrote, right? He's just not a big figure like that. There are other Russians, right? Other current political thinkers, other current political radicals. I agree more with Dugin at the end of the day, except for this one disagreement we had, which I think I was proven right on.
But it wasn't an intellectual disagreement. It was more of a political action disagreement.
Yes, political action. And that's it. It didn't cause a complete rupture in my relations with Dugin, right? And I've still exchanged conversations with his movement and everything, and I have all the respect in the world for him intellectually, and I think from a geopolitical perspective, Dugin will be proved right. But this one thing he did, I think he was very, very wrong on. And that's where I had to say, we need some insulation here.
And so, Michael, would it be fair to say that that kind of caricaturization of Dugin is what has gotten you blackballed in academia?
Well, it has more to do with that for sure than it has to do with his books, because most of the people who reacted to my work on him weren't really interested in his books, I would say. They were definitely more interested in what they saw as the worst political excesses of his writings as applied to the immediate moment. So whereas, as I say, I wrote my dissertation on his Heideggerianism, or comparative study of receptions of Heidegger, including his, that's not something that, that's not the reason they effectively blacklisted me. It had to do with the rawest, most pressing political concerns of the day as they saw them, which is, on one hand, it's fair for somebody to be concerned with Dugin's immediate political rhetoric, because he does have immediate political rhetoric. And as Mark just said, he has immediate political tactics that you can agree or disagree with on good grounds. But it's just a strange fact of the matter that coexisting alongside of those immediate political statements and tactics, there's also this body of intellectual work. So when you engage with the intellectual work and it gets immediately reduced to apologetics for the tactics and the rhetoric, it's, that's where problems arise. And I was able to defend my dissertation, meaning I was able to find a committee of people who understood that, okay, you can put him into a conversation with Heideggerians and do the intellectual work. But it wasn't easy. It almost didn't happen. It took a long time, and there was much more opposition than there was support. And even today, during our conversation, somebody sent me an article that was released today by my former dissertation supervisor in a Canadian newspaper, once again, accusing Dugin and accusing me of being as this and that. So it's like still ongoing, the idea that you're going to smear me through these kinds of attacks and cheap shots. Now, thankfully, the person who wrote it's a nobody, and his opinions aren't worth anything. But the point is that the attacks of that kind continue. So my perspective, as I said, having come from philosophy and political theory, is always, what do we learn studying him that's of significance for those kinds of questions? And it's just indisputable. Heidegger is hugely relevant, and here's somebody who has an interpretation of Heidegger different from the predominant ones. Okay, that's relevant. International relations is a serious discipline. Here's somebody who has a model of international relations that's different. It's not bogus. He's not pulling it out of nowhere. He has arguments, and as Mark said when explaining what it's like to talk to Dugin on a personal level, he's willing to defend and to change his arguments if need be. He's well-read, he's pretty intelligent and articulate, and there's something to think about in encountering him. So that's a dividing line. There are people who are so ideologically committed that they're not willing to think seriously about anybody who's not on their side. And there are people who are open enough intellectually to consider smart authors, whichever side they're on. That, to my mind, is the decisive dividing line. And it's basically what has to do with, I think, the divisions in my university as well.
Oh. Well, I'm sure Michael will come back on. Something happened to his connection, but it's his connection. And so, there he is. Let me bring him back on. Hang on just a moment. And there he goes away again. Hang on, let's give him a few minutes while we wait for Michael to return. Mark, I wanted to ask you, the issue of I got a little bit thrown by his snapping up because I was paying attention to him. Mark, why was he the target of assassination? And by the way, has information come out as to whether he was in fact the target for this assassination, or was it somebody else, or was it Daria rather?
Okay, so again, it's not 100% firm, but we've heard from figures in Ukraine that Daria was a target in her own regard. And we know that the person who at least did the surveillance and maybe planted the explosion and set it off, we don't know that for sure. This Natalya Wolfe, and she's disappeared. She's still alive. There were reports she's already been killed, but no one knows for sure. She was surveilling Daria. She moved into the apartment building. She rented a flat for a month in that apartment building to surveil Daria. And it had to be known at some point that there had to be someone watching, whether it was her or someone else, that Dugin did not get into that, Alexander Galevich did not get into that car, but Daria did, and will blow it up anyway. So she was also on the Mir Tvoritz, the hit list of the Kiev regime, this doxing hit list, and they have marked her name off as liquidated. They got her, right? That's all done, known and done. So he would have also been a target. And the reason he would have been a target, I regard as completely culpable to the Western media's inflation and caricature of Dugin as Putin's brain, as the architect of the Russian intervention in Ukraine. No, he had nothing to do with it. He said it should have been done in 2014, and I agreed with him at the time, but he had nothing to do. They went in today because the Minsk Accords failed, because it was finally, shown beyond a shadow of doubt that they had never any intention of fulfilling them, that they were banning all the political parties of Eastern Ukrainians, that they were killing their media. They were banning all the media that represented the views of East Ukrainians, so that there would be no chance for political change in the country away from this Western geopolitical flipping of the country. So the Kiev regime needs victories. They need successes. They're failing so badly on the battlefield, everywhere except in the social media sphere in English, where, everyone is for months has been, oh, they're winning, and so forth. The reality could not be further from the truth on the ground, on the battlefield, and they need some type of victory. Zelensky, the regime does, the Maidan regime does. One, in order to keep control in the country, because there have already been 12, according to them, 12 assassination attempts on Zelensky. And there was not even once an attempt to blame that Russia did it. It's all internal. He's made a lot of enemies in Ukraine, a lot of oligarchs that he pushed out of the way that still dominate Ukrainian politics, including his own oligarch, Kolomoisky, right? So I think that he needs to show that he's still in control of the country, that his regime is. And at the same time, they need to prove to the Western patrons of the Kiev regime to keep the money and the arms flowing. And the arms are not flowing except from the United States. The major European powers have made no new promises, because more than anything, because they've run out of stock to easily give without cutting too deep into their own, military, active equipment. So they need some type of victory. And they resorted to these sabotage attacks in Crimea and Belgorod that are pinpricks but grab headlines, right? They've resorted to this ridiculous nuclear blackmail over the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Some sabotage and drone attacks in Belgorod in Russia, grab headlines showing that they're still in the fight. But if they had killed the architect of the invasion, that would be seen as a huge propaganda victory, a huge PR victory. And they wanted Dugin, and they wanted his daughter, because in particular, the ultra-nationalist, she was affiliated with him, with his work, as his legacy, everything. But also, she had gone to Azovstal and had, in her work as for humanitarian work for the people there in Mariupol, her work as a war correspondent there, because she was doing journalistic work as that well. And she interviewed people from Mariupol who were talking about Azov shooting them when they tried to flee the city, dragging them down to use as human shields beneath the factory complex there. And she had made a comment that has been taken out of all context, again, just like her father's statements were, that she had said that Ukrainians were subhumans and called for a genocide. No. And it's on record what she said, because it was videotaped. She said that the people in Azov and the others who did this to other Ukrainians in Mariupol, that they are inhuman and that they need to go to war crimes tribunals. And of course, she particularly lambasted Azov. So she became a big target, personal target of Azov. And we know that Azov at this point is so intertwined with the SBU, with the Ukrainian intelligence services, having them brought so many of those people on board, that they are inseparable. So Dugin was a target. She was a target. They hope to get them both together. Instead,
do you guys hear me?
Hello? Oh,
Yeah. Sorry about that. We have my internet went off, and we have a bit of the air raid siren. I'm sorry about that. My internet is patchy because of obvious circumstances. Anyway, chat. Sorry about this. It can't be helped. And gentlemen, I hope that you were, saying nice things behind my back while I was away.
No, I think that's wonderful, because that brings home the seriousness of this whole thing, the tragedy of it, and you're living through it in a way that neither one of us are.
Yeah, it's boredom and panic. Perpetual boredom, not panic. That's not the correct word. Boredom and terror, because you have to just take it in stride. There's nothing to be done, and if you're if there's a bomb coming with your name on it, there isn't much that you can do about it. So just don't worry.
A lot of those bombs literally have Daria Dugin's name on it.
Yeah, and the thing is, I wanted to ask you, and I don't know if you guys talked about it while I was off, and like I said, I'm sorry, my internet just went off and I had to reset it. Daria, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, she had just finished her dissertation, and she was a fairly popular figure in Russian media. Apparently, as I understand it, she seemed like a very personable individual. You're shaking your head, Mark.
She just wasn't big. I mean, there is a circle that she was influential in, but it's a small circle. And she did a few freelance.
She did a few freelance
pieces for art. She was.
Yeah, no disrespect to her. Not to belittle her, but she wasn't a big figure. Certainly not the scope of her father, for instance. And so, was it just out of spite? Is that basically what?
I mean, again, she crossed the wrong people, and she was seen as part of her father's work. They hoped to get both of them together, and at some point they said, "Well, we can still get her," and they did.
Yeah. No, and what has the reaction been in Russia now that this is 2 weeks in the past, and the heat of the moment has cooled down a little bit? What is the current thinking in Moscow, if you will? I know it's a very subjective response, but I'm just curious.
Very few people knew who Daria Dugin was, right?
Mm-hmm.
For them, there is a pretty 29-year-old Russian girl, someone who had her whole life ahead of her and was obviously some type of academic, who was snuffed out right outside the capital in this. That is the way the Russian people deal with this. And there is an outrage there over that. Mm-hmm. But it's not that Daria Dugin, because they didn't know who Daria Dugin was.
No, of course.
A lot of them don't know who Dugin is, right? That's the reality. It's more the outrage that a young 29-year-old pretty woman with her life ahead of her had her life snuffed out by these monsters when she was deliberately targeted despite being a civilian, an academic, in this terrorist attack that brings it home, when for most of the people in Russia they don't have a direct connection. There's not a direct sacrifice, because this military intervention is being done with such a small force, and it is not overtly intersecting the lives of most Russians in a similar way to the way the U.S. invasion of Iraq did not intersect the lives of most Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Gonzalo, do you mind if I ask Mark a quick question? I just want your opinion on something that you might know. I don't know very well, but I'm curious about. So you mentioned that the 2014 situation had Dugin somehow his position suppressed in the media, in the university, and he wanted Putin to go further than Putin did go. But now the situation is a little bit different, because Putin did go further.
Yes.
And this recent event has put Dugin, at least temporarily, back onto the major media channels, because they did, as I say, that program about Daria and so on. So I'm just wondering, whether you've got any thoughts yet or whether you've seen anything yet on, like, is this going to mean more prominence for Dugin because the situation has changed and you had this accident, or is it just going to be like a temporary burst of attention to him and his thoughts that then dies down? Or is the because the operation is more fully committed than it was then, and because you have this high profile attack, is it going to have his name put back into the circulation of official media channels?
I definitely, his name is back in circulation, right? And he is already speaking again on Russian media, on the political talk shows, interviews, in a way that he hasn't for years. I think that I think there's every possibility that he will have renewed political significance in Russia, not even renewed, a significance that he never had before because of this. And in that way, I think that he will be seen as far more ideologically an opponent of the West than Putin ever was, because Putin abhors ideology. He regards it as limiting, as limiting options, and he's a person that always loves options. And if political forces galvanized, either Dugin or galvanized by Dugin, gain more political power in Russia, say, over some of sometimes it would go in parallel, sometimes it would be over. I mean, Dugin wrote a book, Putin Against Putin, where he talked about all of Putin's internal contradictions and, sometimes how he works against not only Russia's best interests, but his own and so forth. I think that the West will very much come to regret the assassination of Daria Dugin if Dugin does gain more political significance, which I believe he has every possibility of doing. I do not believe that this assassination could have been planned and executed without at least a green light from the CIA and MI6. They have that much. They have their own office in the SBU building, right? I do not believe that this could have been done without at least a green light from them. And I think that they will very much come to regret it if Dugin or political forces inspired by him gain a significance that they never had before.
Hmm. Well, we've been going on for a couple of hours, and it's been a delight. And actually, I ask you both to stay after the end of the show, because I just want to say a few things and just chat a little bit about private stuff. But before we get going, are there any final thoughts that you'd like the audience to go away with? I mean, what for you, for both of you, and I'm drawing this out a little bit to give you a chance to think through what you'd like to say. But what is the thing that you would like the audience, the chat, to walk away with from this conversation that we've had today?
I'll go first, if that's okay. So,
yeah, of course.
We have an obligation to try to understand what's going on in the world and to try to understand our place in it, past, present, and future. Whenever we have an intelligent political philosopher or thinker who can help us to do that, it doesn't mean we agree with everything they say, but we have to consider the thoughts of intelligent thinkers. Dugin, because of his relevance, because he's writing from a Russian perspective that we're not so used to, because he knows the Western canon like he does and is drawing on it in ways that make it comprehensible to us, is somebody we should study. I don't think Dugin is above all criticism, but I do think he's above most of his critics, if not all of them, because they don't read what they have to read. They don't think about what they think about. Well said. So I just invite the people who have been intrigued, or whose interest has been piqued, do the work. Doesn't mean you have to fall in love with it. Read, think, learn. These are the questions that are relevant for us now and always.
Well said. Yeah, Mark, he's got the big brain, man.
Yeah, I'm gonna steal his quote on about the critics. That he's bigger than most of his Western critics, at least.
Yeah,
right
the
there.
good line. You should be a writer, Michael. Yeah.
He is, but anyway, I would just reiterate. First of all, I think for most people out there who are not philosophy students, right? And I'm not a philosopher, right? I'm someone who, as an international relations scholar and analyst, I love engaging in my free time in philosophy, and I always have to strain my brain to get around things like Heidegger. So I would encourage everyone else to engage with Dugin at different levels, the levels that you can. I think his primary importance now to most people in the world is as a theorist of a multipolar world, right? Both his political philosophy and the fourth political theory, but also his view of a multipolar world that I can't think of another intellectual anywhere in the world who has at this point iterated a conception, a theoretical conception of a multipolar world that everyone outside the West says that we want better than Dugin has. So I think, that's where people need to start. And you should never, if you have doubts about what we're saying, right, that's fine. You don't have to listen to me, but read Dugin for yourself, right? Don't read the memes and walk away from that. Read his works that you can himself, or even if not everyone, reading is not everyone's forte out there, people in chat and so forth. There's plenty of videos where Dugin speaks in his own words, right? I did a series, I kind of anchored, hosted a series of lectures from Moscow State University that he did on ethnosociology. Michael did an excellent, I believe, 2-part interview with him, at least at some point, and many others have done as well. Listen to the man, at least in his own words, to sometime in the last 20 years, than believing what these reductionists and caricaturists in the Western mainstream media say. Don't trust me. Don't trust them. Investigate it for yourself before you form a conception or troll the man on social media or something of the like. I think Michael said we don't have to agree with everything he's ever said or done to celebrate his intellectual accomplishments, whether you're a Russian or whether you're not.
Well said. Well said. And so with that, I'm going to bid chat. I hope you enjoyed this broadcast. I certainly did. It was a delight to have both my guests, Mark Sleboda, Michael Millerman, both of them who know Dugin's work intimately. They've translated it. The links to their Twitters are below. I suggest you check out Michael's Substack, right?
I'm not on Substack, but I have a YouTube channel where I post political philosophy videos and a school with various courses and books. People will find it if they go to Twitter. They'll see everything from there. Yeah,
please go check it out because, it's been a real delight, a real treat to have you both. Thank you so much for coming on. Chat, I hope you enjoyed the show. Really looking forward to the next one. Oh, and just to give you a preview, the next episode is going to be this Saturday. I'm having Clifton Duncan, the actor who gave a very celebrated speech at the Mises Institute recently, and he's a real delight. He's going to be joined by Chris Martenson, who you guys will probably know. We're going to be talking about that virus that seems to have been going around. And next Tuesday, for you military junkies and geopolitical junkies, I'm having Andrei Martyanov and Pepe Escobar. So just those two, and basically, they're so cheerfully loquacious that I'm just going to sit back and listen to those two talk. It's going to be a delight. So anyway, thank you so much, guys. And yeah, that's all for today. And I'll catch you next time. Take care.